My fingers tightened around the icy steel rail of the hospital bed as the ceiling lights buzzed overhead, casting a sickly white glare that made everything feel unreal, like a scene staged inside a nightmare I couldn't wake from. The sharp scent of disinfectant clawed at my lungs, but it was nothing compared to the sight in front of me. My daughter lay there motionless, her face swollen beyond recognition, one eye sealed shut beneath layers of purple and yellow bruising, her lips split, her neck marked with fingerprints that told a story no one wanted to hear out loud. A rigid cast swallowed her arm, and the shallow rise and fall of her chest made me afraid to blink. When she finally turned her head toward me, her good eye filled with tears she clearly didn't want to shed. She tried to speak, failed, swallowed hard, and then whispered my name like she was afraid it might hurt. When I asked who had done this, her composure collapsed completely. Her body shook with sobs she had clearly been holding back for days. Through broken breaths, she told me it was her husband again, that he'd lost a fortune gambling, that his rage had spilled over, that his mother and sister had restrained her while he attacked her until she couldn't even scream anymore. In that instant, grief drained out of me like blood from an open wound, replaced by something far colder and far more dangerous. I promised her quietly that they had made a catastrophic mistake, one they would spend the rest of their lives regretting, even as she begged me to stay away and warned me that they would destroy me too. She didn't know who I really was anymore, and that realization hurt almost as much as her injuries. I had once been a man others feared crossing, a man trained to assess threats and eliminate them with precision, but time and deception had stripped me of that image in her eyes. I reassured her with a gentle touch, brushing my thumb across the only unmarked skin on her face, and told her she needed to trust me now more than ever. As I sat beside her, memories surfaced like old scars being reopened, memories of how I'd been trapped far away while this horror unfolded. I had been locked inside a place that pretended to be a sanctuary but functioned more like a cage, isolated under the guise of care, my authority stripped away piece by piece. The guilt settled heavy in my chest as I realized how thoroughly I had been removed from her life without ever noticing the danger she was in. It hadn't happened overnight. It started with subtle suggestions that I was forgetful, harmless comments about my age, concerned looks meant to soften me up. Then came the paperwork I didn't fully question, the reassurances that it was for my protection, for my comfort, for my future. I had signed away control believing I was doing the responsible thing, unaware that I was authorizing my own disappearance. The facility they placed me in was quiet to the point of suffocation, its halls polished and sterile, its staff smiling with professional emptiness. I was told it was temporary, a short stay until things were sorted out, but weeks turned into months, and months into more than a year. My finances were locked beyond my reach, my freedom rationed like a privilege I hadn't earned. The man who orchestrated it all visited occasionally, offering rehearsed smiles and hollow reassurances while bleeding my accounts dry to fund my confinement. What none of them understood was that age had not dulled my mind. During decades of service and years working in systems security, I had learned patience, observation, and how to exploit complacency. I paid attention to every careless password, every unattended device, every assumption made about me because of the gray in my hair. While others thought I was fadding, I was mapping routines, identifying weaknesses, and waiting. My mornings began long before dawn, my body maintaining discipline even when my environment tried to strip it away. I wasn't strong like I once was, but I was sharper, and sharpness lasts longer than muscle. The staff underestimated me constantly, and their mistakes only reinforced how dangerous that complacency was. I corrected medication errors, prevented overdoses, and caught misfiled charts more times than anyone cared to count. They laughed it off as luck or experience, never realizing I was proving to myself that I was still fully capable. When the call came from the hospital telling me my daughter had been admitted after a supposed accident, I recognized the lie immediately. I had seen too many versions of it before, heard too many identical explanations meant to cover violence with plausible excuses. I knew I wouldn't be allowed to leave without approval, so I reached out to someone who remembered who I used to be, someone who owed me a debt that couldn't be measured in money. The favor was granted without hesitation. Paperwork materialized, signatures appeared where they needed to, and within hours I walked past protesting administrators and out into the open air, carrying nothing but my wallet and the weight of what I was about to do. Standing in the hospital room, I studied the medical notes like a battlefield report, reading between the lines that politely described brutality in clinical terms. When my daughter tried to repeat the official story, I stopped her gently but firmly, telling her I knew better. She broke down completely then, finally unloading months of terror, apologies, and self-blame that never should have been hers to carry. She told me about the gambling debts, the screaming fits, the promises that never lasted, and the way his family enabled every act of cruelty. She told me about my granddaughter shrinking into herself, about the bullying she endured inside her own home, about adults who laughed while a child learned fear instead of safety. And then she mentioned something else, something that didn't seem important to her but snapped into place in my mind like the final piece of a puzzle. Hidden money, accounts no one was supposed to know about, wealth hoarded while her family suffered. I told her she would stay where she was, safe and monitored, while I went to ensure her child would never be touched again. The house I arrived at looked ordinary from the outside, the kind of place neighbors pass without a second glance, but inside it reeked of neglect and resentment. Trash overflowed, surfaces were sticky with old spills, and the air was thick with laziness and entitlement. Two women barely acknowledged my presence, issuing commands instead of greetings, assuming I would fall in line like everyone else had. I ignored them, following a faint sound that led me to a cramped room where my granddaughter sat curled into herself, clutching a broken toy like it was the last piece of comfort she had left. Before I could reach her, a boy stormed in, mocking her tears and snatching the toy away. I stopped him with nothing more than a firm grip and a calm voice, and the shock on his face told me no one had ever challenged him before. When the women rushed in screaming, I dismantled their aggression without raising my voice, without striking, without losing control. Authority doesn't always require violence. Sometimes it only requires certainty. I laid down rules that were not open for debate and immediately put them to work, transforming chaos into order through sheer inevitability. While they scrubbed and cleaned under my watchful eye, I took care of the child they had neglected, bathing her, feeding her, giving her a quiet space to exist without fear. All the while I was doing something else entirely. Devices were left unsecured, accounts logged in, histories unprotected. I installed safeguards, monitoring tools and backups under the guise of household maintenance, collecting proof while they underestimated me yet again. By the time dinner was served, I had a clear picture of their habits, their secrets, and their vulnerabilities. Information flowed freely when people assumed they were in control. When the man responsible for all of this finally staggered through the door late that night, drunk and aggressive, he expected submission. What he found instead was resistance he couldn't overpower. I didn't need to fight him. I let his own momentum defeat him, then showed him the red light blinking on my phone. The threat of exposure sobered him faster than any consequence he'd ever faced. I told him exactly what I knew about his crimes, his theft, his lies, and the money his mother had hidden while letting his family burn. I gave him a choice that wasn't really a choice at all: walk away quietly and sign everything over, or lose everything publicly and permanently. His rage collapsed into fear, and fear into resignation. The next morning the house felt different, like a storm had passed and left nothing but wreckage behind. Papers were signed, custody was secured, rights were terminated, money was transferred legally and irrevocably. Lies unraveled in front of the very people who had built them. By midday the man was gone, carrying nothing but his own consequences. Weeks later, I sat in a sunlit apartment watching my daughter heal and my granddaughter laugh again, something I hadn't heard in far too long. When the person who had tried to erase me called, wondering when I would return to captivity, I told him never and informed him of the investigations already underway. Age hadn't made me weak. It had made me precise, and precision, when paired with patience, is unstoppable. The days that followed unfolded with a strange mix of exhaustion and renewal, as though we were all learning how to breathe again after years of holding our lungs tight against fear. The apartment was small, but sunlight poured through its windows in the mornings, warming the pale walls and reminding us that life did not have to feel like a locked room. My daughter moved slowly, her body still healing, but her eyes were brighter each day, filled with cautious hope instead of constant dread. My granddaughter clung to me at first, afraid I would disappear the way everyone else had failed her, but gradually she began to explore the rooms, laughing at simple things like the sound of running water or the way sunlight reflected off the floor. Each evening we cooked together, learning how to share silence without fear, learning how peace felt when it was not constantly threatened by someone else's anger. The weight I had carried for so long began to lift, replaced by something steadier and far more meaningful than revenge: purpose. The legal process moved faster than any of us expected, fueled by the documentation I had gathered and the testimonies my daughter was finally able to give. Investigators contacted us, and although the interviews were difficult, there was relief in telling the truth instead of hiding behind polite lies. My granddaughter was enrolled in a new school where no one knew her past, where she was just another child instead of a target. She struggled at first, unsure how to trust classmates who smiled at her, but her teachers were patient, and slowly she began to flourish. Every small victory felt monumental, like proof that damage did not have to define the rest of her life. Watching her learn to laugh again reminded me why I had endured everything I had, why survival alone was never enough if it did not lead to something better. My daughter eventually asked me how I had managed to outmaneuver people who had been hurting her for so long, and I told her the truth: that strength is not always loud, and power is not always visible. It lives in preparation, in understanding patterns, in refusing to underestimate yourself simply because others do. I explained how years of discipline had taught me to think ahead, to gather information, and to act only when the moment was right. She listened carefully, as though realizing for the first time that she came from a lineage that did not break easily. It was a moment of quiet connection, one that repaired something inside both of us that words alone could never reach. There were nights when memories tried to return, when I lay awake hearing echoes of hospital machines and locked doors, but each morning brought a reason to stand again. I spent my time helping around the apartment, cooking, repairing things, teaching my granddaughter how to read maps and solve puzzles, encouraging her to believe she could face challenges without fear. She began to talk more, asking questions, telling stories, and dreaming about the future. I saw resilience growing where fear had once lived, and I knew we were doing something right. Healing did not erase what had happened, but it reshaped how we carried it, turning pain into a reminder of how far we had come. The investigations into those who had wronged us continued quietly in the background, but they no longer consumed my thoughts. Justice was being handled by systems designed for it, and for the first time in years, I allowed myself to step back and simply be present. I realized then that true victory was not in watching others fall, but in watching my family rise. Every smile, every moment of calm, felt like a triumph greater than anything money or power could buy. We had reclaimed our lives, not through force, but through clarity and courage. Time softened the sharp edges of the past, and our routines became something we looked forward to rather than something we endured. We celebrated small milestones: my daughter's first day back at work, my granddaughter's first school award, the quiet joy of shared meals. Each achievement felt like a declaration that we were no longer defined by the darkness we escaped. I watched them grow stronger, more confident, and realized that the cycle of harm had been broken, not by violence, but by refusing to accept cruelty as normal. One afternoon, My granddaughter asked me if people who hurt others ever change, and I told her that some do, but only if they choose to face what they've done. I explained that we could not control their choices, only our own, and that choosing kindness did not mean accepting harm. She nodded thoughtfully, as though absorbing a lesson she would carry with her for life. In that moment, I understood that everything I had endured had led to this simple truth. Protecting the vulnerable is not about strength alone, but about refusing to look away. The apartment slowly filled with reminders of our new beginning, framed photos, colorful drawings, small plants that thrived in the sunlight. Each item represented a piece of a future that had once seemed impossible. I felt gratitude for every ordinary moment, because I knew how rare peace truly was. The past no longer controlled us. It had become a chapter we could close without fear of it reopening. As months passed, my health improved, my spirit steadied, and my sense of purpose grew stronger than it had in decades. I no longer felt like a man defined by what had been taken from him, but by what he had protected. My family was safe, and in their safety I found my own. Revenge had never truly been my goal, restoration was. And in restoring what was broken, I discovered a deeper strength than I had ever known. In the end, what mattered most was not the battles I had fought, but the lives I had helped rebuild. Age had given me perspective, patience, and the courage to act when it mattered most. And as I watched my daughter and granddaughter laugh together, I knew that wisdom, when paired with resolve, will always outlast cruelty, and that love, when defended, is the most powerful force there is.